The 34, the power of the great, there's no question about that. That is, the 34 is an empowerment to 3 other gates. It's an empowerment to the 57 to empower the human archetype. It empowers the behavior of the 10 so that we have the power to follow our own convictions. It empowers the existential 20th gate of the now and empowers us to be active in the now. This is the right angle cross of the sleeping phoenix. The 34, 20, 59, 55. This is the first cross that will actually change its nature in 2027 when the mutation in the 55 takes place. The phoenix will wake up or rise. The 34th gate, power is only great when its display or use serves the common good. Now, the common good is that power in this sense can only be used for 2 things. One is to maintain individual survival. That is for the common good. Very important to see that. And beyond individual survival is that as a direct derivative of that individual survival is the maintenance of the human mutative capacity. Both the 34 and the 14 are there to ensure the power to mutate. The first line of the 34, the bully. The indiscriminate use of power. That's the foundation. That's the foundation. And that indiscriminate use of power was natural for us in the first stages of our human evolution. We had to conquer a planet. We had to conquer hundreds of competitive species in order to survive. And so this power, this indiscriminate use of power, was absolutely essential in its time and place. Saturn exalted, the less negative the resort to power as a manifestation of frustration, the energy to display power as a response to frustration. Now think about the 34. It's a generator gate. It's in the sacral center. Frustration is the theme of the sacral. Just as anger is the theme of the throat. That comes from types, eh? The generator type suffers from frustration, and the manifestor type suffers from anger. The projector suffers from bitterness. The reflector has everybody else's suffering. So this frustration that's here. Imagine that the 34 is connected to the 20. You have, I am busy now. You don't think that's frustrating? You have the 34 connected to the 10. Power to follow your convictions, but that's generator. You can't just follow your convictions. You have to wait to respond to following your convictions. You don't think that's frustrating? The whole thing about the 34 is it's all frustrating unless the whole thing's there. The 1034 is just, I am busy with myself. That's all it is. Or the 3457 is, I'm busy listening. I'm busy being intuitive, But I'm not being intuitive for myself, and I'm not being intuitive in the now. Or the 1034, I'm busy with myself, but I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And I'm not doing it now. I have to wait to be asked. So it's very important to understand that there's a lot of frustration in the 34 because it really is there to use its power to keep us alive, to perfect our form, to give us these powers of conviction, to be in the now and know what the hell we're doing. If the 34 is not acting out of its nature, if it is not being in the world according to its type and authority and definition, then that 34 is a loose cannon, a frustrated energy. Because it is inherently asexual, it can be violent. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that is, the 34th gate is not violent for pleasure or not. It is simply the release of frustration. Pluto and detriment, the comeuppance that is the inevitable destiny of the bully. The ever-present risk of retaliation to power displays. 34s, because there is so much 34 in people's designs, 34s really create difficulties in people's designs. I mean, I've been watching the 34 all my life. I have the other 3 gates of integration. I don't have the 34. So it's been a life study for me, the nature of this 34, including a very long transit of Pluto being there in recent years. And it is remarkable how powerful that energy really is. You know, it drives you to the point that there is no space even for breath. And unless that 34 operates, the people that I know in my life, for example, who are 2034s, they have a real tough time in life. It's very frustrating to be busy and not know what you're doing and not being busy for yourself, as an example. And the recognition that comes with the 34 is something very, very important and very difficult. Individuals who carry the 34th gate need guidance. Now, there is a vast difference between guidance and being led. And there's a difference between guided and being influenced. The 34 needs to have possibilities of how to use its energy pointed out to it, and then allowed to be itself, individual, not influenced. But the 34th gate without guidance, like the 2034, where thoughts, where awareness must become deeds, not just simply being busy, but knowing the value of that busyness and knowing that what you're doing is for yourself. Because when that power of the 34 is used for others and the self, the individual, doesn't benefit from it, they're deeply melancholic. Individuals don't like to be led. 34s, though, need to be guided, particularly 2034s. That is, without the 10 and the 57. Momentum, the second line. These are people that don't know, of course, that they have all this power, and they're going to get other people who are going to try to call them out. And remember that the calling comes from many places here. From the 57, from the 10, from the 20. Mars exalted, the ability when victory is in sight not to lose perspective. That is the power that grows when victory is in sight. Now these are the kinds of terms that really confuse people when they look at lines. What victory? The victory is to empower mutation. And the victory is to empower mutation, hear this out, to empower mutation as a new archetype whose perfected form will be able to mutate and transform others. Empower them in the now with a new mutation. Now that's easier to say than to do. which is why so many 34-2s, when you knock on the window, they throw a brick at you. I mean, if you expect the 34-2 just to let you come in and say, hey, look, you got a lot of juice, I want it, be careful. They don't know how much frustration is in them. They do not know how much power lurks within them. So if you knock on their window, you might get a bullet in the head. You know, you got to be careful about these people. You know, it's like opening the door of a cage and a wild beast comes out. By the way, if you have friends who have the 34-2, don't give them that story. Venus and detriment, a tendency to be emotionally carried away by the smell of victory. The power of growth limited by impatience. Now look, it is called momentum. These people build their power in isolation. You know, they're hermits. And only the will of the majority can really bring them to offer their power to others. But when there's a chance that the mutation can take place, that they can empower something, then they can often get carried away because they think the power is everything. I mean, the 34th gate and the 14th gate both have this deep energy arrogance because they are the most energetic of all the gates. You know, they have this enormous power and they're aware of it. Now, when I say they're aware of it, you know, this is just a genetic trait. But they do carry with them this sense of superiority because they're a power source, which is why they get so frustrated. I mean, the lower trigram here, they have no transpersonal skills. They don't know that there's another at the 57. They don't know there's one at the 10. They don't know there's one at the 20. I mean, they're really in their own little shell there, and all of a sudden somebody knocks on their window. The third line, Machismo. You know, the first line says the indiscriminate use of power, and the third line says the indiscriminate display of power. Note the difference. I mean, the first line is there to use its power. So the third line, you know, hits you first. By the way, don't get too carried away with all my violent images, just to give you a sense of it. That the first line will take its power and use it. It will hit you. The third line will threaten you physically. You know, they will put their hands up or whatever. They will display rather than use their power. Through trial and error, they discover it's dangerous to always use your power. It can backfire on you because you don't know who the other is. Saturn exalted the great malefic. Nice. Where machismo is unfortunately is invariably backed up by power. This is an exaltation only in that it is natural and not contrived. The display of power that defines any role. Think about what individuality carries in it as a genetic strain. You got the 39th gate of provocation. All the moods are there. You got the 38th gate of the fighter. You know, when you're dealing with individuality, what you're dealing with is a genetic structure that is designed not to be interfered with, and at its extreme will get violent in the defense of its right to not be influenced. And integration is the most individual of all the circuitry that we have in the body graph. It's not even a circuit. So when you're looking at the power that's inherent here in the 34, understand that most of that power is used to get people out of the way. Stay out of my face. Don't interfere with my business. Don't tell me what to do. Now remember the joke. The 2034 is very impressive. Charisma. Everybody would love to have a little charisma. Not me. I am busy now. I am busy now. I am busy now. I am busy now. And then somebody comes along and says to the 2034, yes, I see that you're busy now, but I see that it's a waste of your wonderful talents and skills and energy, and I'd like to point you over there in that direction. And the natural tendency of the 34 is to say, get out of my face. So it's one of those things to recognize about the nature of the power in the 34 and the 14, is that the power is there so the individual can withstand influence, but it also gets in the way of them being open to guidance, and they do need guidance. They do not understand the collective and the tribe well enough, and they need to be guided as to how their potential, their mutative capacity, can find a way in the collective or the tribe. But so difficult for them because their very power wants to deny anybody the right to influence them, and they will automatically display it, particularly in this lower trigram, because they're not ready for the other. And they don't know that part of what the other is that they have a gift of perhaps being able to guide them successfully to victory, to mutation and expression. Mercury in detriment, a reasoned and calculated display, the communication of disinformation, a calculated display of power in order to define the role. Now, that is that's a common trait. There are a lot of 34s that just use that power without having actually to engage in the use of that power. In other words, they can put a display up that seems so threatening that it acts as a preventive so that they don't really have to use the power. You scare people by your tone. So they just don't want to get involved in attacking you at any level because they don't want that tone to get any worse than it already is. The whole thing is that if you call their bluff, they still have all the power. So it's not good to call their bluff. The upper trigram. Here we have a transpersonal skill. Here we have the ability to externalize power to the other. But that also means that the other is something that is already established. That is, the 57 and the 10 and the 20 are something that the 34-4 can recognize. That's why you suddenly have triumph. Instead of all this bully machismo business, all of a sudden you have triumph. The freedom and absolute victory to unlimited use of power. That means that the moment that you can be truly mutative, you've got it. For the individual to be truly mutative, all they have to do is live out their nature. They have to live out their definition. They have to live out their type. They have to live out their authority. They have to learn to accept melancholy as a creative force in their life. That sadness is a value to them and not a problem. That happiness is a productive field. Pluto exalted, a tendency in victory to restrain excessive power in favor of more subtle and covert styles. The inherent confidence to use power subtly. Now look, these are people that recognize their mutative capacity. But because they also know the other, they know that they have to use their power more carefully. Remember that the inherent power of this gate, by the time you're in the upper trigram, is the recognition that that power has a deep impact on others, and you're concerned about not overwhelming the other, because then there's no success. So it can develop through its recognition of the other. Remember, the fourth line is about friendship. The fourth lines are always trying to make friends. The 34-4, is not there not to make a friendly connection with the other. And they don't want to burn those friends out, which they can, 30th hexagram, fourth line. So they have a way, as long as those friends don't influence them, don't try to influence them, they will use their mutative power subtly. They won't smack them in the face with it. Mars and detriment. Ego gratification in the unrestrained use of power with impunity, inevitably leading to abuse. A lack of confidence that can lead to abuse of power. This is the overwhelming of others. This is the overwhelming of others because you really don't feel secure in your mutative capacity. You know, this is somebody that tries to hammer a knowing into somebody else who isn't really ready for that knowing. Instead of being confident in that what you know will have its mutative power and that it will take different time scales with different beings, and of course here that doesn't happen. The transpersonal in individuality is rarely of benefit socially other than in the 1222. It simply gives the individual a window that the other really does exist, which is very hard for the individual to actually accept. That the other exists, because if the other exists, they have to have validity, you know. They may be an influence that is detrimental to the individual. So these transpersonal lines give the individual a grasp that the other deserves respect, that nothing gets done without being able to deal with them, and you cannot mutate them until you really grasp what they're about. In the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds here, the fourth line, we have a change in the cross. The 55-59 is replaced with the 37 and the 40, the channel of community. This is the only cross that has two definitions, the 2034 and the 3740. And if you think being juxtaposed is fixed, this is the most fixed of all juxtaposed crosses. It's called the cross of power. I'm busy. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm sure not doing it for myself. I think I'm doing it for the community. That's what this cross says. The left angle cross is the second version of the left angle cross of duality. And the fifth line is called Annihilation. The total elimination of resistance. These are the forces that can use their power completely in moments of crisis, when its use is practical, when they're called upon by the needs of the society, and at the moment that that opportunity exists for them, they can annihilate any resistance to their power or to their mutative capacity. Remember, they got to learn that in this life. It takes time. Mars exalted the power to destroy completely, and once this is accomplished, the ability to transfer the power to normal processes. The resistance to release power other than when necessary. Now remember the story of the general. The general is selected to be dictator of the month, does their job, gives up the power when it's over, and goes home. It's very important. This return to the normal. This is my joke about stupid before enlightenment, and it's not my joke. Stupid before enlightenment and stupid afterwards. In other words, you may have the mutation in between, the so-called enlightenment in between, but you still have to go back to normal processes. You still go back to sleep and eat and, all of these other things. So the 34-5 uses its power selectively and then withdraws, by the way, which makes them seem even more powerful. The moon in detriment, a difficulty in shedding the patterns established to deal with resistance, symbolized by its phases, the feeling that nothing is permanently annihilated, the discomfort with the need to always release power. You come in, you solve a problem, you use your power, you bring a mutation, you pull away because it's correct for you, only to discover that the dumb bastards don't know how to deal with it. And you have to go back out and do it again. The moment that the 5 has to stay in the empowerment without its opportunity to step away, it begins to deteriorate. Individuals lose power the more they have contact with any force. You know, if you're in the refrigerator business, it's okay for you to stand up in front of an audience and introduce them to the brand new refrigerator. That's classic individual stranger of consequence business. You have all your power then. You're different, you're a mutative force. Nobody has enough time to think about all the things about you that they really don't like. Nobody gets to know you long enough to discover that you're quirky as hell and weird, and you're not like them at all, and you make them uncomfortable. Nobody is with you long enough to find your flaws in order to be able to attack your knowing in the first place. Familiarity breeds contempt for individuals. That individual that makes the presentation, they get their mutative possibility, and it's perfect for them. But if you give them a servicing job in which they have to deal with the client every day, that client is going to become less and less pleased with them, less and less comfortable with them, and there's going to be more and more pressure on them from their bosses to conform, to have other people do these things. That's called individual hell. The 6th line. Common sense. Yes, well, we would hope, eh? You know, there is so much power inherent in this gate. And of course, the machismo of the 3rd line is what the 6th line lives out in the early part of its life. You know, constantly displaying its power. Only to discover that that isn't necessarily productive, generates a lot of resistance and jealousy. The 14th gate and the 34th gate always attract jealousy. You know, it's like the jealousy for somebody who has so much money. They have all this power. Knowing when enough is enough. And you only learn that after you've displayed your power over and over and over again to see what actually comes out of all that, and it isn't necessarily productive. Remember that what is productive for the 34 is deeply complex, because you have 3 other gates that it can connect to. That's why it is so difficult for individual power to manifest correctly in the world. It's a real complexity at work. The earth exalted the good sense when, having bitten off more than one can chew, to spit part of it out. The restriction of the release of power when one does not have the strength to maintain it. See, mutation is not something that should require babysitting. You know, either the mutation has taken place, or basically what you're trying to do is that you're trying to hammer a round peg into a square hole. I mean, you know right away. I mean, I knew that with human design. The first person I tried to explain it to grasped it. That's mutation. Instantaneous. When an individual can explain it. So it's very important here to see that the strength is equivalent to being able to express that mutation. And that's a matter of common sense. That's a matter of coming to recognize the right timing of things. Again, about being yourself, particularly individuals when their timing is conditioned by their melancholic chemistry. Jupiter and detriment, enthusiasm overriding better judgment invariably leads to complications. A lack of restrictions that can sap one's strengths. You know, the 34 gets to the 57 and thinks that's it, but it's not. Or the 34 gets to the 10 and thinks that's it. It's not. You know, there's the seduction of getting to the other end of the channel, without recognizing that integration doesn't operate that way, that it's a complete system. And that when you're looking at the 34-6, you're not just looking at integration. You're not just looking at those three other gates. You're looking at the entire individual circuitry. That's the perspective of the 34-6. So it looks out on integration, it looks out on the individual empowerment process, and it realizes something essential, that all 34s use more energy for more things than are necessary. Because they don't have their way. See, if you're not yourself and you don't know how to enter in, you don't know what's for you in this life. This is a generative gate. If you're not doing what's right for you in this life, you have nothing but frustration out of that 34th gate. Nothing but frustration. In entering incorrectly, you will have a place to effectively use that power. This individual process in the beginning of this quarter of mutation takes its next step in moving from the 34, leaving behind the individual process, and entering into the logic process, going into the 9th gate, going to detail. The energy, still a sacral gate, the energy for detail. In other words, what common sense leads to is the need to focus on the details so that the use of power can benefit the collective, that mutation can benefit the collective.